The diesel fumes from Harold Vance's 1959 Minneapolis Moline G6 hung thick in the cold November air as he pulled into the Madison County Livestock Auction just outside Winnisett, Iowa. It was 1973, and every other farmer in the gravel parking lot had climbed down from tractors that still had that new paint shine. John Deere 4430s, International Harvester 1060 SXS, Case 1370s. Machines that cost more than most men in that lot had paid for their first 100 acres. But Harold, he just killed the engine on that old Mini MO, a tractor that had been considered outdated when Kennedy was still president, and walked toward the auction barn like he did no explanations to anybody. Now, before we go any further into Harold's story, you need to understand what was happening in American agriculture in 1973, because this wasn't just about one stubborn farmer and his old equipment. According to USDA census data, farm debt in the United States had increased by 286% between 1960 and 1973. The average Midwest farmer was carrying debt loads that would have been unthinkable to their fathers. Land prices in Iowa had jumped from an average of $213 per acre in 1965 to $471 per acre by 1973, a 121% increase in just 8 years. And the equipment? A new John Deere 4430, the kind half the farmers at that auction were driving, cost around $15,800 in 1973. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $105,000 in today's money for a piece of equipment that would be obsolete in a decade. The Madison County Bank had been sending Harold Vance loan offers every single month since 1969. Pre-approved financing, zero down payment options, 5-year terms at what they call competitive rates, usually hovering around 8 to 9%, though by late 1973, they were creeping past 10. Clayton Morris, the bank's agricultural loan officer, had made it his personal mission to get Harold to modernize his operation, as he called it. Clayton drove a new Buick Electra 225 and wore suits that looked out of place in a town where most men's idea of formal was a clean pair of Dickies and a BOLO tie. Harold, Clayton would say, leaning against the counter at the Madison County Feed and Seed, "You're leaving money on the table." A man farming 640 acres with equipment from the Eisenhower administration? That's not thrifty. That's just stubborn. Harold would usually just nod, pay for his twine or his mineral blocks or whatever he'd come for, and head back to his truck, a 1964 Ford F-250 that he bought used in 1967 for $800. The truck had 187,000 miles on it by 1973, but the engine still fired every morning, and that was all Harold cared about. The thing about Harold Vance was this: he wasn't poor, and he wasn't stupid. He'd inherited 480 acres from his father, Virgil Vance, back in 1958, and he'd managed to buy an adjoining 160-acre parcel in 1963. Paid cash, $18,000, money he'd saved from 5 years of corn and hog profits. His father had died right there on that land, suffered a heart attack while hand-cranking a Farmel H that had a dead battery. Harold found him slumped against the rear tire, still warm. Virgil was 56 years old. The farm had a $12,000 mortgage on it at the time, and the stress of those payments, combined with bad corn year in 1957, had likely contributed to the heart attack that killed him. Harold never forgot that. Never forgot the look on his mother's face when the banker showed up 3 days after the funeral to discuss the loan situation. Never forgot how his mother, Ruth, had to sell off 40 head of cattle just to keep the farm out of foreclosure, while Harold, barely 24 years old, figured out how to run the operation himself. So when Harold took over in 1958, he made himself a promise, the kind of promise you don't write down, but you carry in your chest like a second heartbeat. He would never owe a bank more than he could pay off in one harvest, and if possible, he wouldn't owe them anything at all. By 1973, Harold had paid off the remaining mortgage his father left behind. The farm was free and clear. Every acre, every building, every fence post. He owned it outright, but that didn't stop people from talking. At the Rusty Bucket Diner on Main Street in Winterset, the morning coffee crowd, farmers mostly, along with a few implement dealers and the occasional insurance salesman, They'd see Harold come in, order his eggs and hash browns and black coffee, and the whispers would start before he even sat down. "Still running that old mini MO," someone would mutter. "Thing's gotta be 15 years old." "Closer to 20, another would answer. "Saw him pulling a 4-bottom plow with it last spring. Took him twice as long as it would have with a modern rig." "Pride goeth before a fall," old Vernon Tucker would say, sipping his coffee and shaking his head. Vernon had just traded in a perfectly good Oliver 1850 for a brand new white 2 to 135, financed over 7 years at 9.5% interest. Vernon felt modern. Vernon felt successful. Vernon didn't feel the weight of that loan payment coming due every 6 months. Not yet anyway. Now, the Minneapolis Moline G6 that Harold was running. Let me give you the specifics here, because this wasn't just some random old tractor. The G6 was introduced in 1957 as part of Minneapolis Moline's New Idea line. It had a 336 cubic inch engine, produced about 65 horsepower at the PTO, and was designed to compete with the John Deere 70 and the Farmer 450. In 1959, when Harold's father bought it brand new, it cost approximately $3,800. By 1973 standards, it was underpowered for a 640-acre operation. Modern wisdom said you needed at least 90 to 100 horsepower to efficiently work that much ground. But Harold had something that offset the horsepower deficit: time and the willingness to use it. He'd be in the field at 5:30 in the morning, sometimes earlier, working until the dew got too heavy or until the sun went down and he couldn't see the furrows anymore. He knew that old Mini-MO inside and out, knew exactly how much throttle to give it on a grade, knew which gears to use for which soil conditions, knew that the hydraulic pump had a slow leak that you had to top off every 40 operating hours. He'd rebuilt the clutch himself in 1968, replaced the starter in 1971, kept the air filter clean, changed the oil every 50 hours like clockwork, greased every fitting before every use. The tractor wasn't fast, but it was paid for, and it ran. Harold also ran a John Deere 60, a 1958 model he bought at an estate auction in 1965 for $1,200. That one handled the lighter work, mowing, raking hay, running the grain auger. Between the two tractors and a willingness to do maintenance himself, Harold kept his operation running while his neighbors signed loan papers and waited for delivery on machines that came straight from a factory. If you're sitting there thinking this sounds old-fashioned, maybe even foolish, I want you to consider what was happening economically in rural America during this period. The early 1970s were a time of massive expansion in agriculture. Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was pushing his famous get big or get out philosophy. Butz encouraged farmers to plant fence row to fence row, to maximize production, to leverage debt to expand. Grain exports to the Soviet Union were booming. Corn prices hit record highs in 1973, $3.02 per bushel, up from $1.08 just 2 years earlier. It looked like a golden age. And that's exactly when the trap was set. Banks were eager to lend. Implement dealers were offering financing deals that seemed too good to pass up. 0% interest for the first year. Deferred payments. Trade and allowances that made your old equipment seem like it was worth more than it actually was. Farmers were buying 200 horsepower tractors to work 400-acre farms. They were buying combines that cost $35,000. They were expanding, borrowing, betting on the future. Harold Vance watched all of this happen, and he kept running his old equipment. His neighbors thought he was scared, thought he lacked vision, thought he was stuck in the past, unable to adapt to modern agriculture. What they didn't understand was that Harold had a vision. It just wasn't the same as theirs. Harold's vision was simple. Own what you have, owe nothing to anyone, and sleep soundly at night. The first crack in the boom came in late 1973 with the OPEC oil embargo. Diesel fuel, which had been around 15 cents per gallon in early 1973, shot up to 55 cents per gallon by early 1974. Suddenly, those big horsepower tractors weren't quite as economical. A 150 horsepower tractor could burn 8 to 10 gallons of diesel per hour under load. Harold's old Mini-MO working at a steady pace, would burn maybe 4 gallons per hour. When diesel prices tripled, that difference mattered. But fuel costs were just the beginning. By 1975, grain prices started falling. That $3.02 corn dropped to $2.54 by the end of 1974, then to $2.25 in 1975. Farmers who had borrowed heavily based on high commodity prices suddenly found themselves in a squeeze. Their loan payments stayed the same, but their income dropped. Then interest rates started climbing. This is important, so pay attention to the numbers. In 1973, the prime interest rate, the rate banks charged their most creditworthy customers, was around 8%. By 1975, it was 7.86%, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that agricultural loans, which were considered riskier, were running 2 to 3 percentage points higher than prime. By 1979, the prime rate hit 12.67%. By 1980, it peaked at 21.5%. Agricultural loans during this period could run as high as 18 to 22%. Imagine borrowing $15,000 to buy a tractor in 1973 at 9% interest, then having that loan adjusted or refinanced in 1980 at 18%. Your payment on that 7-year note, which might have been manageable at $240 per month, suddenly became $390 per month. And that's if you could even get refinancing. Many banks, seeing the agricultural sector collapsing, simply refused to extend credit. According to USDA data, between 1980 and 1985, the United States lost over 235,000 farms. That's not 235,000 acres. That's 235,000 family operations gone. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, auction signs at the end of driveways. Families who worked the same land for 3 or 4 generations wiped out in less than a decade. But Harold was still farming. In 1978, Clayton Morris from a Madison County bank showed up at Harold's farm unannounced. This was unusual. Clayton didn't make house calls unless it was a problem, and Harold didn't have any loans with the bank, so there shouldn't have been a problem. Harold was in the machine shed, rewiring the ignition on the old John Deere 60 when Clayton's Buick pulled into the yard. "Harold," Clayton said, stepping carefully around the oil spots on the shed floor, "you got a minute?" Harold wiped his hands on a rag, nodded. "What can I do for you, Clayton?" Clayton looked uncomfortable. His suit, usually so crisp, looked wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep it between us." Harold waited. "You know Vernon Tucker's place?" "The 320 acres adjacent to your south property line." Harold nodded. Vernon had been one of the loudest voices at the diner, always talking about his new equipment, his expansion plans, his vision for a 1,000-acre operation. "Vernon's behind on his payments," Clayton said quietly. "Way behind. He's going to lose the farm. The bank's going to foreclose by spring." Harold didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. He'd seen this coming, even if Vernon hadn't. "The thing is," Clayton continued, "the bank's going to auction that land. And I thought maybe you'd be interested. It adjoins your property. Good soil. And you'd have the cash to buy it outright, wouldn't you?" There it was. The same bank that spent a decade trying to loan Harold money, trying to convince him to modernize and expand and leverage his equity, was now coming to him because he was one of the few farmers in the county who could actually buy land without financing. "What's Vernon going to do?" Harold asked. Clayton shrugged. "He's got a brother in Des Moines. I imagine he'll find work in the city. It's happening all over, Harold, not just Vernon. I've got 18 farm loans in default right now. 18 families that are going to lose everything." Harold thought about Vernon's wife, Margaret, thought about their 3 kids, thought about the look on his own mother's face when the banker came calling after his father's death. "I might be interested," Harold said, "but not if it means Vernon and his family get thrown off the land with nowhere to go. You tell Vernon he can rent that 320 acres from me for 5 years at a fair rate if I end up buying it. Give him a chance to get back on his feet." Clayton stared at Harold like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. That's not how these things usually work, Harold. Maybe not, Harold said, but that's how it's going to work if I'm involved. In March of 1979, Harold Vance bought Vernon Tucker's 320 acres at auction for $103,000. Paid cash. That same week, he signed a 5-year lease agreement with Vernon. $35 per acre per year, which was below market rate, but enough to give Vernon some income while he worked a job in Des Moines and figured out his next move. Vernon never did get back into farming, but he also never forgot what Harold did for him and his family. By 1980, Harold Vance was farming 960 acres, debt-free, with 2 tractors that were over 20 years old. Now, I need to pause here and address something, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking this sounds too simple. You're thinking, well, sure, if you never upgrade your equipment and you work twice as hard, you could avoid debt. But what kind of life is that? And that's a fair question. But here's what you need to understand about Harold's operation. He wasn't avoiding progress. He was choosing sustainable progress over leveraged expansion. Let me give you some specifics. In 1976, Harold did buy a new tractor, a 1965 John Deere 4020, which he purchased from the state sale for $4,800. The 4020, introduced in 1964, was one of the most successful tractors John Deere ever built. It had a 404 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine, produced 91 PTO horsepower, and was known for being reliable and relatively fuel efficient. By 1976, an 11-year-old 4020, in good condition, was a smart buy. It gave Harold the power he needed for his expanding acreage, but he paid cash and bought it used when the depreciation had already happened. He also invested in maintenance and infrastructure. In 1977, he built a new machine shed, 40 by 60 feet, steel frame, concrete floor. Cost him $8,200, and he paid cash. That shed meant he could keep his equipment out of the weather, which extended its life significantly. He bought a Lincoln arc welder in 1974 for $320 and taught himself to weld well enough that he could fabricate his own repair parts instead of ordering them from dealers at markup prices. Harold's philosophy wasn't about deprivation. It was about ownership. He believed that a farmer who owned his land and equipment outright had a kind of freedom that a farmer buried in debt could never have. He could make decisions based on what was right for the land and the operation, not based on what the bank required to keep the loans current. And starting in 1980, that philosophy was put to the test in ways that nobody could have imagined. The agricultural crisis of the 1980s, sometimes called the farm crisis, was the worst economic collapse in rural America since the Great Depression. We've already talked about the interest rates and the price drops, but the human cost was staggering. Suicide rates among farmers increased dramatically. The Farm Aid Concert in 1985, organized by Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young, was created specifically to draw attention to crisis and raise money for farmers facing foreclosure. In Madison County, Iowa, Harold Vance watched his neighbors fall like dominoes. The Hendersons, who farmed 800 acres for 3 generations, lost everything in 1982. The Kowalskis, who'd expanded to 1,200 acres in the late 70s with borrowed money, were foreclosed on in 1983. The Rasmussens, the Mitchells, the O'Briens, all gone. Auction signs, moving trucks, families packing up and leaving land that their great-grandparents had broken with horse-drawn plows. Clayton Morris, the loan officer at Madison County Bank, who'd spent so many years trying to convince Harold to borrow money, had a nervous breakdown in 1984. The bank brought in an outside consultant to handle the foreclosures because Clayton couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't look these families in the eye and tell them the bank was taking their land. Last I heard, Clayton moved to Arizona and never worked in banking again. But Harold kept farming. By 1985, Harold Vance was one of only 3 farmers in Madison County who'd been operating continuously since the 1950s without ever declaring bankruptcy or losing land to foreclosure. The other 2 had inherited so much land that they'd been able to weather the storm despite their debts. Harold was the only one who'd done it debt-free. In 1987, Something happened that showed just how different Harold's situation was from everyone else's. There was a late spring freeze that year, hit on May 8th, wiped out a significant portion of the corn that had already been planted. A lot of farmers had to replant, which meant extra seed costs, extra fuel costs, extra labor, and a delayed harvest that reduced yields. For farmers who were already operating on thin margins and dealing with debt payments, it was devastating. Harold had to replant too, lost about 180 acres of early corn. But here's the difference. He didn't have to call the bank and beg for an extension on his loan payment. Didn't have to choose between buying seed and making his tractor payment. He took the money out of the savings, money he'd been building up for exactly this kind of emergency, bought the seed, replanted, and kept going. That same year, a young couple named David and Kathy Brennan were about to lose their farm, 240 acres that David's grandfather had homesteaded. They had 2 small children and nowhere to go. David came to Harold, hat in hand, and asked if Harold might consider buying them out and leasing the land back to them, the same arrangement Harold had made with Vernon Tucker years before. Harold thought about it for about 10 seconds, then said yes. Paid David a fair price of the land, $82,000, which was below market value even in the depressed market of 1987, but gave David enough to pay off his debts and start fresh. Then Harold leased it back to David for $40 per acre per year with an option to buy it back within 10 years if David could get his finances straight. David Brennan never did buy that land back. Ended up taking a job with the county road department and farming part-time. But he and Kathy stayed in the area, raised their kids there, and David still speaks about Harold Vance with a kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or war heroes. Now, I want to circle back to something I mentioned at the beginning about Harold's father, Virgil, because this whole story, when you really look at it, isn't just about financial decisions or tractor specifications or interest rates. It's about legacy and what we pass on to the next generation. Virgil Vance died of a heart attack at 56 years old, stressed and broke, with a mortgage hanging over his head. Harold found him dead on a farm that wasn't fully paid for, and that image, his father slumped against that tractor tire, never left him. Harold's entire financial philosophy, his whole approach to farming and life, grew out of that one terrible moment. Harold married late, at 38, to a schoolteacher named Donna Mitchell. They had 2 children, a daughter, Sarah, born in 1974, and a son, Robert, born in 1976. Harold was determined that his children would never find the way he'd found his father, dead from stress on a farm mortgage to the hilt. In 1992, Harold turned 60 years old. He'd been farming for 34 years at that point. The farm was not only debt-free, it had grown to 1,280 acres, every square foot paid for. The equipment was old but functional. He'd added a 1972 International 1066 to the fleet in 1989, paid $6,500 cash, and there was $127,000 in the farm savings account as an operating cushion. That same year, Harold's son Robert graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agricultural engineering. Robert had grown up watching his father maintain and repair old equipment, and he developed a talent for it. Robert came back to the farm with ideas about how to modernize the operation sustainably, buying good used equipment, investing in maintenance and longevity rather than chasing the latest models, building financial reserves instead of leveraging equity. In other words, Robert had learned the lessons his father had been teaching him his whole life. In 1995, Harold did something that surprised everyone. He bought a new tractor. Not used, not from an auction, not 20 years old. Brand new, a John Deere 7800, 145 horsepower, $68,000. It was the first new piece of major equipment Harold had ever purchased in his life, and he paid cash for it at the Rusty Bucket Diner. When word got out, the coffee crowd couldn't believe it. Harold Vance bought a new tractor? Someone said, did hell freeze over? But if you understood Harold, it made perfect sense. He'd been farming for 37 years. He'd paid off his land. He'd helped half a dozen families stay afloat during the worst agricultural crisis in modern history. He'd built a financial foundation that would support the next generation. He'd earned the right to buy a new tractor, And more importantly, he could afford it without borrowing a dime. Robert took over the majority of the farming operation in 1998. Harold, at 66, stepped back to an advisory role, still helping with planting and harvest, but letting his son handle the day-to-day decisions. The farm was producing corn, soybeans, and running a modest cow-calf operation, about 100 head. Gross income was around $320,000 per year, and net income, after expenses, was typically between $85,000 and $110,000, depending on the year. But here's the thing that really tells you about Harold's legacy. Robert Vance, as of the year 2000, was farming 1,280 acres completely debt-free at the age of 24. Most farmers his age, if they were farming at all, were buried under equipment loans, land mortgages, and operating debt. Robert had zero debt and a paid-for operation because his father had refused to follow the crowd, had refused to borrow when everyone said he should, had refused to chase growth for growth's sake. Harold Vance passed away in 2006 at the age of 74. Heart attack, just like his father, but this time on a farm that was completely paid for and being successfully operated by the next generation. His funeral was held at the Madison County Methodist Church, and there were over 400 people there. The church only seated 200, so people stood outside in the August heat and listened to the open doors. David Brennan gave part of the eulogy. He talked about how Harold had saved his family when the bank was ready to throw them out. Vernon Tucker spoke too, even though he was fighting cancer by that point and could barely stand. Vernon talked about how Harold had given him dignity when he'd lost everything, had given him a chance to keep his head up in a town where everyone knew he'd failed. But the most telling moment came from Robert Vance, Harold's son, who stood at the front of that church and said something I think everyone in agriculture needs to hear. My father taught me that land is not commodity. It's not leverage for a loan. It's not a tool for speculation. Land is a legacy. It's the thing you pass on to your children, and it's meant to be passed on without chains attached to it. My father never made me feel poor because we drove old trucks or ran old tractors. He made me feel rich because I knew that everything we had, we owned, and that's a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with the balance in a bank account. Now, I've spent considerable time researching these stories because I believe this history matters. The farm crisis of the 1980s reshaped American agriculture in ways we're still feeling today. According to USDA census data, there were approximately 2.95 million farms in the United States in 1980. By 1990, that number had dropped to 2.14 million. We lost over 800,000 farms in a single decade. The average farm size increased from 426 acres in 1980 to 460 acres in 1990, which tells you that consolidation was happening. Larger operations buying out smaller ones. But what's often missing from the economic data is the human story. The families destroyed, the suicides, the divorces, the children who grew up watching their parents lose everything and decided they wanted nothing to do with farming. An entire generation of agricultural knowledge and tradition lost. And then you have people like Harold Vance, who understood that the most dangerous thing in farming isn't drought or disease or even low commodity prices. The most dangerous thing is debt that you can't control. Because once you're leveraged to the hilt, you're no longer farming for yourself. You're farming for the bank. And when the market turns, and always turns eventually, the bank doesn't care about your family or your legacy or your land. The bank cares about getting paid. Harold understood this at a gut level because he'd seen what debt had done to his father. And he made a decision that probably seemed foolish to most people at the time. He would rather work harder with older equipment than own money he couldn't guarantee he could repay. The principles Harold followed aren't complicated. They're actually pretty simple. But simple doesn't mean easy. It means buy what you can afford, not what the bank will loan you. Old equipment that runs is better than new equipment you can't pay for. Growth for growth's sake isn't success. Sustainable growth is success. Your land is your legacy, not your leverage. A farmer who owns everything is freer than a farmer who has everything but owns nothing. These principles, when you look at them, apply far beyond agriculture. They apply to anyone making financial decisions in their life. We live in a culture that encourages debt, that tells us we need the newest car, the biggest house, the latest technology. And if we can't afford it, well, there's always financing available. But what Harold Vance understood, and what his father learned too late, is that debt is a form of slavery. It binds you to decisions you might not want to make. It forces you to prioritize payments over people, over land, over your own well-being. If you're watching this and you lived through the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Tell us what it was like in your area. Tell us about the families you knew who lost their farms, or the families who managed to hold on. Share your memories, because this history needs to be preserved. Too many young people today have no idea what happened to rural America in that decade. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't remember it, we're bound to repeat it. If you found value in this story, hit that subscribe button, because I'm committed to bringing you more of these historically grounded stories about American farm life. These aren't just tales for entertainment. They're lessons from a crucial period in our agricultural history, researched and presented to honor the people who lived through it. And if you're someone currently facing financial decisions, whether in farming or any other part of life, ask yourself this: am I building equity or am I building debt? Am I working toward ownership or toward bigger payments? Am I creating a legacy or am I creating chains? Harold Vance died with a paid-for farm, a successful son carrying on the operation, and a reputation in Madison County as a man who helped more people than he'd ever hurt. He drove old trucks and ran old tractors, and people talked about him for years because of it. They called him stubborn and old-fashioned and out of touch. But when the dust settled and the banks foreclosed on everyone else, Harold was still there, still farming, still free. And in the end, that's what mattered. The last time I drove through Madison County, Iowa, I took a detour past the old Vance farm. It's still in the family. Robert's son, Harold's grandson, is running it now. Third generation on that land. Farming debt-free. Carrying on a legacy that started with a young man who found his father dead on a mortgage farm and swore it would never happen to his own children. There's a historical marker now at the Madison County Museum with a display about the farm crisis of the 1980s. It includes a section about local farmers who survived the crisis, and Harold Vance's name is on it. Next to his name, there's a quote that Robert donated to the museum, something Harold used to say when people asked him why he wouldn't modernize his equipment. I'd rather be slow and free than fast and owned. Think about that the next time someone tries to sell you something you can't afford. Think about what ownership really means and what freedom really costs. And if you got thoughts about Harold's story, about whether his approach would work today, or about your own experiences with debt and farming and legacy, share them in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, because these lessons are too important to forget. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.